So to kickstart the event, please join me to warmly welcome Director, Asia Pacific Center for Environmental Law from the Faculty of Law in US, Associate Professor Jolene Lin, who will be speaking on decarbonizing the maritime industry. What is the role of law? So Professor Jolene Lin is a law professor at the National University of Singapore and Director of the Asia Pacific Center for Environmental Law. Her research on transnational environmental law currently focuses on climate change litigation. She's currently writing a book on climate change litigation in developing countries, and this book will be published by Oxford University Press in 2024. Before joining NUS, Prof. Jolene was Associate Professor of Law at the University of Hong Kong. She has served as a consultant to the Hong Kong Department of Justice, NGOs, the United Nations Environment Programme, and global law firms. She has also served on the Hong Kong Appeal Tribunal Panel, Buildings Ordinance, and the Hong Kong Appeal Board Panel, Town Planning. So without further ado, Associate Professor Jolene Lin, please.
Thanks, Nicholas, for the very warm welcome, and good morning, everyone. It's one of those things where in pre-Zoom days where people give you this long spew about everything that you probably have done in, make it sound so great, but actually, it's just lots of work, that's all. You kind of sit there and fiddle with your thumbs and try not to look embarrassed. But now with Zoom, you just kind of, just again, fiddle your thumbs and nobody sees that. Thank you very much to the organizers of this Maritime Decarbonization Symposium 2021 for inviting me. I'm also extraordinarily impressed by those who have signed up on this Saturday morning to listen to various people speak about this issue. I'm extremely honored. Before I start my slideshow, I'll just basically say a few words. First of all, I think it's incredible because the fact that there is a symposium dedicated to the issue of decarbonizing the global shipping sector is, to me, an incredible milestone. When I first started my research career in looking at climate change mitigation and adaptation policies and laws and regulations. This was in year 2007, and at that time, there wasn't any discussion whatsoever about what decarbonization didn't even appear in popular usage or in the literature. And as I would talk about later in my presentation, the issue of shipping emissions has been very critical, but an issue that has not really gotten much mainstream attention. Fast forward today to 2021, I think we are very, very far off in a good way, but at the same time, a lot remains to be done. And oftentimes, I think that as an environmental lawyer, we always talk about the struggle being 4 steps forward and 3 steps back, or 2 steps forward and 1 step back. I do think that really at this point in time, we have no time for steps back, but it feels that that's a lot of that is happening in light of what the urgent meeting that's going to take place at the global conference COP26. But yes, with that as background, let me start my presentation. And decarbonizing the maritime industry. What is the role of law? I will say it briefly for those who want to know the short answer. I think it's very little because of the nature of the issue, but I will explain that more throughout in my presentation. So first, let me share screen and then we can dive in. All right, there we go. Okay. So this is my title slide. I've also included my my website address. So if you want to find any information about climate change, law and policy, as well as stuff that I've written about the shipping sector, please, this is a resource, if so to speak. Now, what is the outline of my presentation? Today, I want, in a very brief 20 minutes, I'm going to talk about why is reducing the carbon footprint of the global shipping sector critical for climate change? What is the current international legal framework that governs this shipping sector's decarbonization efforts? What are the challenges? What can be done? These are all critical questions, and I hope I can just at least give you a sense of what are the challenges and what are the solutions that we could come together for. Now, the carbon footprint of shipping is massive. All of us are part of it, simply because the global economy is highly dependent and intertwined with global shipping. International shipping carries about 80% of global trade by volume. Every single vegetable that you've eaten in Singapore, chances are 4 or 5, unless it was grown somewhere in your garden or in a Sungai Buloh area, it has come by international shipping. It accounts for about 2.2% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and that's a significant amount. The numbers look small, but when we look at total volume in terms of absolute figures, it is quite staggering. Now, what happens is that, why are we concerned? We're concerned because shipping emissions are set to grow as international trade increases, as people become more affluent, as people desire more consumer goods, and etc. Shipping is only expected to grow. And this also therefore means an increase in global greenhouse gas emissions from the shipping sector. So shipping's carbon footprint is predicted to increase from 50 to 250% by 2050 unless action is taken. Now, when we look at the top 10 most carbon emitting companies in Europe, in other words, which are the ones with the biggest carbon footprint in Europe? And the reason I'm using Europe is because the data is fairly, is very transparent in that sense, because they have an internal emissions trading scheme and a shipping carbon accounting registry, which allows you to access the data and therefore have a pretty good look at the figures. If you look at the top 10 most carbon emitting companies in Europe, you would see that at number 8 is the Mediterranean Shipping Company. And this shipping company's carbon footprint is equivalent to the coal plants and to Ryanair, which is the budget airline, which is the equivalent of Tiger Air, Air Asia, that sort of thing. So, you know, with a lot of attention being paid to dirty coal, decarbonization of the coal sector, sometimes people forget that actually shipping companies also have a very significant carbon footprint. Important to note too that, you know, it's not just about trade, right? It's also about the way we live, the way we spend our time. Many of us who have been stuck in Singapore for a long time during this COVID pandemic, one of the things that has been becoming increasingly popular has been cruises to nowhere, right? Just basically jumping on a cruise ship just because it allows you to just get on something apart from anything that moves, really. It seems like Singaporeans need to go on something that moves and get us out of our island. If you look at the CO2 performance of cruise ships compared to passenger cars, it's pretty staggering. The smaller the cruise ship, of course, the more problematic it is, but it is a large carbon footprint. In this slide is basically what they predict to be the highest efficiency on paper based on calculations. The light blue is basically looking at what is their predicted lowest efficiency using, again, you know, calculations on paper. But look at their real world efficiency. It's extraordinary. It's quite extraordinary. It's, if you were to look at the size, just look at the graphics, like the size of the dark blue columns, they're almost twice that of the light green, which means that we have to be cautious about the fact that what we calculate in terms of emissions may also be much less than what is actually emitted. Now, when we talk about regulating the global shipping sector, it is commonly said that the global shipping sector has been very fortunate to escape legal regulation for the longest time. If we look at the international legal treaties governing climate change, starting with the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Kyoto Protocol, and the current Paris Agreement on Climate Change, there are no greenhouse gas reduction targets for international shipping. In other words, because shipping is global, the idea was that there was no way we could actually impose sensible targets on the shipping sector, given that under international law, the targets are imposed on states. So there's been no reduction targets in it as a result. We do have a what we call the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS. This is supposed to be the constitution of the oceans. It's the international legal framework governing the protection and the use of the oceans. It does have, this framework does have rules on marine environmental protection, but no specific obligations regarding greenhouse gas emissions. And so as a result, the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, which is the main international organization responsible for the shipping sector, has been tasked with has been given the glorious task of regulating the shipping sector's carbon footprint and the steps taken to reduce that footprint. Now, the IMO in 2018 has issued, after many years of debate and discussions and political negotiations, they launched what they call the initial IMO strategy on the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions from ships. It's an extraordinarily inspiring title. Just going to call it the IMO strategy. The IMO strategy applies to all member states who are, well, all states that are members of the International Maritime Organization. The focus is on international shipping. We're talking about shipping between ports of different countries. So it doesn't capture shipping between ports of the same country, right? And what's the goal? Here we have the goals basically set out in fairly just 3 bullet points. The goal of the IMO strategy is to reduce carbon intensity of international shipping by at least 40% by 2030 and 70% by 2050. And total annual greenhouse gas emissions is to be reduced by at least 50% by 2050. The baseline year is 2008. And bear in mind that under the Paris Agreement, the global decarbonization target is net zero by 2050. Net zero, which means by 2050, that we should be having 0% net emissions. So the idea that total annual greenhouse gas emissions from the global shipping sector is to be reduced by half by 2050 sounds perhaps impressive, but has to be taken in context of the global consensus on what is necessary to reduce, what is necessary in order to prevent us from tipping over into the dangerous zone of the climate change, emergency. Now, the initial IMO strategy basically looks at, is organized according to 3 categories of measures: short-term measures, medium-term measures, and long-term measures. I'm going to briefly just speak about them. Under the short-term measures, the IMO basically has this strategy has basically emphasized the need to improve existing energy efficiency frameworks. The IMO has a number of energy efficiency initiatives, which are meant to basically, which are meant to be like sort of a step towards the full-blown efforts that was included, that is sort of laying the ground basically for the IMO strategy. And the idea is, as a short-term measure, we're going to improve on that. We're going to keep on focusing on energy efficiency. There's also a strong emphasis on operational measures, for example, speed reduction, slow steaming, etc. Operational measures are seen as the, there's a heavy emphasis, there's a strong emphasis on in a strong short-term measures because they're seen as relatively low-hanging fruit. But there are a lot of technical discussions on that, as well as political wrangling on whether operational measures are really acceptable to all, because it does have impact on the speed of delivery of products from one end of the world to the other. Now, national action plans are really the obligation. So the IMO basically is encouraging or requiring member states to develop their own action plans, which will then be guide the member state in their actions to decarbonize their contribution to global shipping emissions. So in the consultation on Singapore's National Action Plan, the consultation basically ended in June or July this year. And so we're going to be looking at, we'll see soon what Singapore's measures would be under our National Action Plan, which is known as the Decarbonisation Strategy 2050. Now, medium-term measures, there's a lot of hope being placed on low and zero carbon fuels. The idea is that we're going to start making these action plans in the short term and in the medium term. We're going to try to update them, keep at it, execute them, implement them. And finally, there is this old debate between carbon taxes and emissions trading, both of which are market-based mechanisms to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in any one sector. I say it's an old debate because this debate has been taking place for a long time within the IMO as to which is a better strategy for regulating greenhouse gas emissions of a global sector. Do we impose a tax, or do we want to go down the route of a global emissions trading scheme? I'll talk a little bit about carbon tax because that's basically the favored policy option amongst the majority of IMO member states and the IMO itself. Basically, a carbon tax is a levy on every ton of carbon dioxide equivalent that is emitted. So basically, if you emit 60,000 tons of carbon dioxide on a particular journey, and the levy is, for the sake of argument, $5 per ton, so you basically pay 60 times 5, which is $300 of tax for the carbon emissions of the entire journey. This is a very simplified example. Now, what this means is that the more emissions a ship generates, the more it pays. And therefore, it creates an incentive, right? The idea is that it creates a monetary incentive for the people who pay to reduce their emissions, so they pay less. Therefore, ship owners and operators can choose or invest in clean technologies and alternative fuels in order to reduce their tax burden. Again, this is I think, in theory, what should happen, but it is extraordinarily complex because of the nature of shipping. The fact that the ship operators and the ship owners and the charterers and the insurers and the reinsurers, there are many, many parties involved in, say, container shipping. And therefore, the incentives are very different for each party in response to this sort of taxes. And I think that's well documented and well understood by those in the industry. Now, the idea is that these tax revenues can be earmarked to, for example, to support developing countries to update their port infrastructure and all sorts of and research and development into low carbon fuels. This was pretty much in response to a cry from the majority of developing countries as to the imposition of a carbon tax. Now, long-term measures. There are, interestingly enough, the IMO strategy doesn't really emphasize any particular mechanism or approach. They're really pinning their hopes on this. They're really pinning their hopes on low or zero carbon fuels. It's a technological response to the problem, and there is a lot of work being done on developing low or zero carbon fuels as a substitute. Now, why is this the case? This is a picture, an image that I have taken from the IMO document. And you can see here what the what is the greenhouse gas emissions reduction potential for each policy solution, right? If you look at I mean, everyone knows that we will need a mix of strategies. But if you look at all the strategies across, look at volume optimization, that's like 1 to 10%. I mean, that's hardly anything. Yes, extensive speed optimization up to 75%, but slow steaming is not a solution for it's already being explored a lot because it's being done quite a bit. But if we look at full electric, for example, it would be 50 to 90%. Biofuels, third generation, 90%. Hydrogen and other synthetic fuels, 80 to 100%. So there's a lot of research and development being done now into hydrogen, into biofuels, and of course into nuclear power as a source of energy for the global shipping sector. All these solutions have their downsides, which I could talk a lot about, but I'm conscious of time, and I'm happy to take any questions about my presentation. Thank you very much. And I guess it's over to you, Nicholas. Thank you.
Thanks, Prof. So we currently have a couple of questions from the floor. I'll just be reading out the first question. Sure. The first question goes, given that it is difficult to achieve consensus at a global level, should we then not start from a regionalization approach? So for example, the EU enforcing its law, and from there, things begin to spread so that we can at least make some progress.
Sure, thanks a lot for that question, Nicholas. It's a very good one. I think, first of all, nobody wants a regional approach because in the shipping sector is by nature extraordinarily global. And regional approach equals piecemeal approach. Piecemeal approach equals to increased transaction costs. It means that a company or a voyage, a voyage that's taking a place across and crossing various jurisdictional lines will then have to comply with different carbon regulations, and that would be a nightmare. So I think there is there is generally consensus, especially in industry, that a global approach is what we are looking for. As for the EU has basically been playing a very active role in trying to galvanize climate action in the global on the global stage. So its decision to try to push for more action in their shipping sector has been a way of signaling that if you in the global community are not going to do more, the EU is going to try to do more. And because some of the largest shipping companies are domiciled in the European Union, they do face domestic pressure to decarbonize. And so short answer, regionalization is not really a possibility for such a global sector that is exposed to the transaction costs of a piecemeal approach.
Okay, thank you, Prof. So we have a next question. That's an interesting one. Should we have a green Donald Trump to push the world of shipping into decarbonization? So it seems like the debates at IMO never ends.
Donald Trump is a really bad name. I'm not sure I want to use his name for anything, but hey, I'm not talking to any Republicans in the room. I mean, even if I do, I stand by my words. I think if you are saying, do we need a green strongman? Do we need someone to impose his views on everyone else in the name of environmental protection, in the name of the climate emergency? On my bad days, I say, yeah. Hell yeah, that would be awesome, because I'm sick of hearing these debates, which I have heard for a long time. But at the same time, we need to appreciate that international law and international regulation, international politics, international relations doesn't work by force. And when you attempt to force a solution, I think that we have to consider that how sustainable it is. How sustainable would it be? because these solutions and this require buy-in from a lot of stakeholders. And you're not talking about someone who is in there only for 4 years and therefore only has to account to his electorate for 4 years. So I do think, however, that there needs to be a lot more public spiritedness in the sense of the global commons and that's really lacking. It has been lacking for a long time, whether within the IMO or within the entire United Nations system when it comes to dealing with climate change, because of its very strong intersections with the economy.
Okay, we have another question, and it goes, can you elaborate on the part where, in the beginning where you said there's very little role of law? The role of law is very little.
The role of law is very little because while the IMO strategy is created by and agreed by consensus in an international organization, it doesn't really meet our classical definition of law because there are no sanctions for the failure to comply. But it is still law in the sense that we international members of the IMO are committed to adhering to the rules of the game and therefore will comply and ought to comply unless they decide to go off on a bender for whatever reason. The role of law, I guess, is also limited in the sense that, again, I guess I should use the word, the traditional notions of law, okay, where we're talking about sticks and carrots and we're talking about how do you use sanctions, how do you use how do you create incentives for compliance, because there's very little that can be done in an international forum. Why do I say that? If you look at there is nothing to stop a state from saying, look, I don't even want to be a part of this treaty anymore and I can exit. You mentioned Donald Trump. Donald Trump exited, took the United States out of the Paris Agreement. That's a very good example of how international law has its limitations, but and therefore it's very important that we as members of the global community understand the value of a rules-based order. Do we really want to descend into a chaos? Finally, I would say there's not so much a limitation on law as much as the fact that the solutions to decarbonization for the shipping sector, I think, are mostly technological and operational. And therefore, the role of law is to create as level a playing field so that industry is willing to take those opportunities and risks.
Okay, then will Singapore be imposing carbon taxing? Can Singapore do it? This is another question from the floor.
Sure. Singapore already has a carbon taxation system. However, its coverage is mostly on businesses that are based in Singapore and have a certain that meet a certain threshold of emissions. Singapore will not be imposing, I think, no country will be imposing carbon taxes on its shipping unless everyone else does so, because it will not make any sense. It will have to be a concerted global effort to impose carbon taxation. It's either everyone does it or nobody does it at all.
Okay, maybe we could do just one last question. So, yeah, it's an opinion question. Which, in your opinion, is the best strategy for carbon emissions reductions? So is it the model similar to what the EU is doing, or perhaps the carbon levy?
The EU basically currently has a setup that is geared towards a global carbon system, a carbon tax system. I don't think it wants to differ very much. And the idea that they are focusing on accounting, verification, and reporting of greenhouse gas emissions is to create transparency. Is so that other actors in the space, including civil society actors, can say, look, this company says it would decarbonize, but really the numbers don't add up. So I think it's complementary. It's not an either or proposition.
Okay. All right. Thanks so much, Prof. This is the final question from the floor due to the nature of time. But we'd like to just thank you for being here, for spending your Saturday with us. We really appreciate your time, and this was a great conversation. So thank you once again. Take care and stay safe. Yeah.
You too.
Thank you.